Is silence a sound? This question has been inside me for many years. As a child, I used to look up the sky and I used to ponder, how do these stars, galaxies and planets exist? Isn't it so amazing when you look at them the way they are up there in the universe? As we all know, 13.6 billion years ago, there was this big bang. Our infant universe was shook by the sound waves of the Big Bang. And that's when you realize that sound is the very fundamental and the core of life. And I'm very fortunate to be a sound engineer and to be a musician, to dwell my life in sound. And it's been 40 years and it's been a very beautiful journey. What is sound? Sound are vibrations that reach your ear, that you can hear. We call it sound. Animals have the wonderful ability to listen to sounds that humans can't hear. They have a much bigger frequency response. Sometimes we think that our ears can only hear, but our hair, the skin, the whole body can start hearing. You could sense vibrations all through your body. I'm a self-made man and I'm self-taught in music and in sound. To me, music, noise, silence, everything is sound. As a child, I always was inclining towards the beauty of sound, whether be it the instrument that I chose, the tabla, or the music that I hear, or the plane that would go up in the sky. I would running out with the boom. The sound fascinated me as a child. It was during my school days I was very much encouraged in my school to pursue music despite the academic pressures. Way back then, music was my priority. I took up music in my life. I started playing the tabla. I used to learn the tabla just listening to tape recorders and recordings of Ustad Zakir Hussain. I used to listen to a lot of A.R. Rahman's music that inspired me with sound. And I just realized one thing. It was not the musical notes, it was not the beats, it was the sound that was pulling me into the universe of itself. My thirst for sound did not stop with musical instruments alone. As I grew up, I finished my post-graduation in computer science, and I did realize that there was some call for me. There was some call for me to dwell in music, to remain in music, to be in sound. But as you know, in a conservative Indian family, every one of us must study, we must go through our graduation, our post-graduation. It's a very typical from an Indian family. I went through my post-graduation in computer science and I was a project associate in IIT Madras for a very brief time. And it was only then, when I was 24, I had a severe urge to do something that I wanted to do in my life. Something that was very passionate inside me. Music, sound. It was a very difficult decision to make, to leave everything and start a studio on my own. It was not very easy. To set up a studio is very expensive. But at that time, coming from a very modest background, I ran across to find timbers from used market. I used to bring old wood. I used to bring it to my house, dry it in the sun, use carpenters to build my studio. And how did I make the acoustics? Not using fancy equipments, but I used to hear. I used to play my tabla in the room and I used to design the room based on how nice my tabla would sound. That's when you realize that you don't have to discover yourself. You have to find ways to express your feelings, and that leads to something new, and that to me is discovery. Passion will pull you to what you want to do in your life. Faith is a very key ingredient for one to pursue their passion. When I look back and when I see that I live in a life full of sound, I realized there were 5 important qualities that one must follow for you to pursue your passion. Number 1, recognize and embrace. You must recognize your passion. You must recognize the talent that is given to you. You must put your effort into what you recognize inside of you, and you must embrace that with a lot of love. It's not enough you do it just because somebody says, or it's just your intellect that says you could do something. You must embrace it with love. The second quality is to seek and discover. You must keep seeking. When I used to be young, I had a tape recorder, a very small one. It used to play all the music, but I never found the bass of the tabla coming out very well from the speakers. I used to put that into a washing machine that had a big cavity, and immediately the tape recorder started to sound so amazing, the deep bass coming out. That's when I realized space could create sound. Something that is space could create sound, that could help sound emanate, it could multiply sound. And I used to have speakers when I had my home studio 2-3 decades back. It was very interesting. I used to keep the speakers on the tabletop and they used to rattle, and I used to keep sponge below that. Sometimes I used to realize that the whole resonance of the table was changing the sound of the speakers. So I used to take the lungi, as we call it, put the speakers on the lungi of my father, hang it with a curtain rod, and realize the speakers sounded exceptional and I could mix music in that. These were days when I did not have resource. Sometimes you realize that when you have a lot of resource with you, you do not put your fullest effort. The seeking never comes. When you have to seek, you should not have resource. We call it thedal in Tamil, you have to keep searching. The thirst is very deep. When microphones came, when I first bought my microphone, I used to keep it on the floor and play the tabla. There used to be thuds. So I used to stack up pillows, keep the microphone on top of the pillow, and then start playing, and it used to capture very clean sound. So when there is no facility, you realize that you have to discover things, you have to innovate, you have to seek. The third quality, which is very, very important, is to take risk and to experiment. There comes a time in life where that you may have a big mountain or a wall in front of you, and you should not restrain yourself from your effort. You must experiment, jump across to see what's on the other side of the mountain. It was the story of Life of Pi. I had just then started my studio, and I received a phone call for me to record something for a US client. I agreed for the recording, and the singer told me to connect myself with the company that was doing this project. When I connected, they said it's a remote location recording. I was not aware of what remote location recording was, but I was very, very keen and passionate to take up this recording. And they told me there is this software that I have to do, and they would be listening from the US, and the singer would be singing here, the recording would be happening in the US. I did not even have a machine that could support all this or a network. But it was my faith that I had to do. I wrote an email to them saying, I do not have the technology, but I have the passion to do this work. Could you help me? This was my email to them. And immediately they wrote to me saying that they would give me a software and a license, and if I'm ready to do it, they would be very happy. It took me 2 full days, 2 sleepless nights to see what the software was, to how to connect India to the US. And I did this song's recording. It was the Pi's lullaby that I was recording, and also the Indian instrumentation that comes in the movie. Later did I come to know it was for the movie Life of Pi. And when it was nominated for the Oscars, you have no idea how much I thanked myself for taking a risk to plunge into the technology, learn it overnight, and then today it's like a visiting card in my work. The fourth quality that you get when you start to realize that you're becoming a professional is to maintain commitment and to seek excellence. Excellence is a very, very important part for every one of us. Whatever field you are in, excellence is something that doesn't have a limit. It's infinite. And that restlessness for excellence is what will bring in perfection. This to me has always been a part of my work. Sometimes there are movies that I mix. I would have delivered, the song would have been released, but 3 days later I would go back to the song, listen to it, and if I had to make a few changes, I would still make those changes, take a copy and keep it for posterity. As a recordist myself, I realized that artists and art form is something that comes like a gift through you. Artists will leave the world, but their art form will remain. And I am a person who prints history for music. So I have a very big responsibility. So if excellence is a part of that, you realize that the best of artists, the best art form is printed for history. I've been working on various fields, be it music, dance, theatre, wildlife films, advertisements. In fact, recently I'm working on a project for an automobile company. How do you mask sound? So how can you come up with ideas that will mask sound of the engines? And you realize that many a times limitations will not allow us to think deeper. What stands out is understanding one's limitation. You must understand your limitations. It's about discovering oneself with new ideas that will be a groundbreaking result for the industry. I face a lot of difficulty when I record artists inside a studio. Studio is a very closed environment. It's soundproof rooms. You don't have listeners and rasikas who are in front of you who enjoy your art form. Art needs appreciation, and in a studio it's a very clinical environment. It's like an MRI scan. The artist is always judged. So I used to think to myself, what could I do to make them feel very comfortable? This is man management, making them psychologically feel the best. How good do they sound to themselves on their headphones? How much of the tracks that I give to them really inspires them that they could bring their best? So as I'm a catalyst between the performer and the listener. It's up to me to bring the best out of an artist, and sometimes a mix can make or break a song, as I call it. It's just that moment that you capture. There are instruments like Nadaswaram, Tawil, the Bhangra, Dhols. They are all very loud. When you bring them inside a studio, they sound so tiny. These instruments are beautifully designed. Nadaswaram is made for temples. All these big percussion instruments in India are made for outdoor performances like the Tapp, Bhangra, Dhols. I used to take all these artists inside the studio and I was very uncomfortable with the sound. So I started to take efforts to go outdoor, go to temples, go to environment that was conducive to the instrument, take all the equipments that I could outside and start recording. And I realized the best sound was something that I could capture. It started to create a kind of a magic for people who came to listen to the final production. It's not actually the microphones, it's not the instrument by itself or the artist. It's about bringing an environment for sound. The instrument, the artist, the acoustic space, all of this is a very important ingredient for me to capture as a recordist. Recording sound has taught me life. Sometimes we take our human body for granted because we know that all our senses are in coherence and work very well. It was during the COVID pandemic. I did not realize that I was affected with COVID. I had just then lost smell. It was in the March of 2020. All these 5 sensory organs, seeing, hearing, tasting, touching, smelling. What if none of this is a part of you? And I almost faced a problem for a year. It was then you realize that how much these sense organs mean a lot to you. It's just a moment between my being able to hear and my being able to not hear that can define what I do as my passion and what I do in my profession. Our sense organs are very dynamic. If you realize when you touch something very hot, you immediately react. But the moment you touch it 2-3 times, it adapts to it. The same with sound. When you hear something for a prolonged period of time, you don't realize how loud it is and you keep going louder and louder. Let me show you a very interesting experiment on ear perception. How do you hear sound? How does your brain perceive sound? Recommend you wear a headphone. So let me play this small music clipping. So this is the normal way you hear the song. But when you tilt the treble, the highs, sometimes in your music player you have high frequency, low frequency, bass and treble. When you tilt it up and start hearing it, it's very sharp, right? The moment you hear something very sharp, your brain tunes to it and it thinks it's normal. Just 5 or 10 seconds and you're used to it, and the moment I drop it down, you feel everything is dull now. Isn't it? Now if I'm going to make it even more dull, what is sounding dull now will sound sharp later. So I've reduced all the high frequency, so keep listening to it. So you're used to this sound now. When I put it back, you feel everything is clear and again very sharp. This This is how beautifully your brain can actually adapt itself to what it hears. It's so dynamic, it's interesting. Let's take tanpura for example. Indian instrument, they keep it on their body and they play. And you realize that singers sing so incredibly with the tanpura on their body, but today we use these electronic devices to emanate the sound. So when I was recording the tanpura, it was so interesting for me to understand what kind of sounds could come from it. The sound was so deep, frequencies that your body can hear, probably not your ear. So something that's deep like a bass guitar, something that's so deep. And it's told in the Vedas, in ancient history, that a shruti which means sound, has every note in it. It's not just 1, 2, 3, 4, C, D, E, F or a sa re ga ma pa. All the notes are in one sound. And I realized that when I recorded the tanpura. So you have only one note, two notes coming out of the tanpura. But when I'm going to isolate the sound, the frequency, you'll realize that there are so many sounds, all the pitches that come. So here is an example. 2 will come then. And then you realize that almost the whole keyboard, all the pitch of the keyboard is actually there in just 2 strings of a tanpura. In the last 20 years of recording music and sound, I realized that it's not merely the technology that one has to understand. You have to understand the very art form, the artist, and the passion that is there between you and the person whom you record. Your dream can have very many destinations. I wanted to be a tabla player, I wanted to be a music composer, but today I'm an established sound designer. I engineer sound for some of the best projects across the world. I was like a boat on a free-flowing water. I never showed resistance. Do not show resistance to the flow of your own life. Give yourself the opportunity to see what it can bring to you. And I allowed myself to just listen to what creation was taking me into. Music is sound. Noise is sound. Silence is sound. You live once and you have to live in excellence. I didn't choose sound. It made me choose its path.